Hi, everyone. My name is Kenneth Milner. I'm the Director of Policy and Government Relations at the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association's offices, where I'm joining the call from today, are based in Ottawa, which are the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence in this land reaches back to time immemorial. Further, the CHRA respects and affirms all inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous people across the land. And today we have a very exciting webinar Q&A for you all today, as we are joined by the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, Sean Fraser, who's here to talk about the federal budget and Canada's housing plan that were released just last month. As the voice of the community housing sector in Canada, the CHRA has been consistently advocating for many of the things we've seen in Budget 2024. And as an advocate, I'm personally quite excited to hear about the impacts that what those announcements will have on the community housing sector, and how we might be able to work with government to implement them in effective ways. It's a really exciting time to be engaged in housing work. It's a quite meaningful time to be engaged in this work. And we need your support to make sure that we can continue to offer opportunities and events such as this one. And we'd like to encourage you all, if you are not already CHR members, to join, as well as to sign up on our website for the Flash, our newsletter. A little bit of how today's webinar is going to work. I'm going to introduce the minister to deliver some quick remarks, and then most of today's session will actually be an open Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, you can see at the bottom of your screen is a Q&A function. If you type in your question there, that's the best way to make sure you get your questions to the minister. I'll be moderating the Q&A by asking each of you to ask your questions directly, at which point one of my two colleagues, Chloe or Leah, will unmute you, and then you can ask your question directly. So with that, I'd like, oh yes, sorry, and the final thing is today's webinar is going to be recorded. So if you have any issues with appearing on screen, please let one of the CHRA team know. And with that, I will pass it over to the minister to deliver his remarks.
Excellent. Look, thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity to connect today. It's really a privilege to be able to discuss some of the programs that we're moving forward with those who know the sector best. And perhaps before I get into some of the specifics of the measures that were included in the recent federal budget, let me just say thank you to those who are on the front lines of the housing crisis, helping some of the country's most vulnerable. I just want to let you know how much I sincerely appreciate the work that you do every day. There's people from my own community that I've had the opportunity to connect with, and they're doing meaningful work to help people who really need it. It's been a very difficult few years for the community housing sector. The challenges have been exacerbated by some of the fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic and housing affordability challenges in recent years. And I just want to say, as a person who cares about vulnerable people, you're doing the real work and breathing life into the right to housing by ensuring some of our most vulnerable have access to the supports that they need on the ground. For my part, I'm very excited about the next number of months. We have an enormous opportunity to step up the level of investment, not just in the community housing sector, but in housing more broadly, to help solve the housing crisis. Our goal is not to simply play at the margins. We want to solve a major national problem that's causing a very serious set of consequences for people in every part of the country. The recent federal budget seeks to do three main things. The first is to build more homes. The second is to make it easier to rent or to buy a home. And the third is to ensure that those who can't afford to keep a roof over their head nevertheless have access to this essential need that too many go without. In the first bucket, and perhaps I'll focus on that third pillar, but just by way of introduction, the first bucket, in order to really cure the supply gap, we need to kickstart a building revolution in Canada. There's certain challenges that we see today that are difficult to overcome, but the more I talk to people who work in housing, the more I become convinced that the housing crisis is solvable. There's a few things that we want to do to help cure the supply gap that exists. We want to reduce the cost of building home. We want to make it easier to build homes. And we want to change the way that homes are built in this country. In order to reduce the cost, there's a series of tax measures for new apartment rentals, which we find over the course of the life cycle of a building tend to offer lower rents as compared to a condominium, for example. We can do this through certain tax measures, whether it's the GST rebate, the capital cost allowance. We can do it through low-cost financing measures, and we can do it by making public lands available. And when we reduce the input cost of land into the equation of building, we will look to extract new levels of commitments when it comes to affordability for those who are going to obtain the benefit of building on public land. We also are shifting our approach with respect to public lands and are not limiting ourselves to properties that are declared surplus, that are beyond the needs of the federal government, but are seeking to identify properties that are not incompatible with the other federal purpose on other lands, which increases the inventory of public land that we can use, but maintain ownership of. We're going to be launching a new initiative with a view to entering into long-term leases for as little as $1 in some instances, in order to reduce those input costs to drive a greater level of affordability with homes that will be built on public lands. In addition to reducing the cost, we have to make it easier to build homes. It is so challenging when you look at the mishmash of different rules that exist across Canada. You look at the zoning practices of certain communities who literally make it illegal to build the kinds of homes that will help solve the housing crisis. And you look at the lengthy permitting processes that change these circumstances that could render a project not feasible based on the time of approval versus the time of application. We're doing this in a number of ways, largely by putting federal money on the table in exchange for changes by other levels of government that will make it easier to build homes. You'll have seen a lot of the work through the Housing Accelerator Fund. You've likely seen some of the conditions we're talking about when it comes to infrastructure funding, whether that's transit or water and wastewater. But we want to do more to make it easier to build homes and support communities in getting homes built more quickly. Finally, under the chapter of the plan that's dedicated to curing the supply gap, we do want to change the way that homes are built in this country. We have an opportunity to dramatically pick up the pace of home building by moving forward with incentives that will create an appetite for the factories to scale up. Factories today, in some instances, can build twice as fast as a traditional construction method. And we have a unique opportunity to create a pipeline of projects that will drive that demand and specific incentives for home building factories to do more. There's a series of measures that we put in to make it easier to rent or to buy in the market, including a renter's bill of rights that we will be working with provinces to adopt, certain measures that will make it easier for renters to receive protection against rent evictions, some new transparency in the rental history of different buildings. At the same time, we put measures in place to help transition people into the market and, importantly, free up homes that are already on the market by supporting communities who are trying to address the challenges relating to short-term rentals and addressing issues around mortgage fraud. But I think the main item that you want to hear from me about is largely on the community housing sector. I'm very enthusiastic about the opportunity for the federal government to increase its ambition. We need to do better in Canada. About 4% of the homes in this country are offered outside of the market. That's not good enough. The OECD average is approximately double where Canada sits. This is a direct and predictable consequence of decades of failures by governments, I should say of liberal and conservative persuasion, to fail to invest in affordable housing. We have seen a 30-year period preceding the National Housing Strategy where federal government simply washed their hands of the responsibility to invest in affordable housing, and we're paying the price today. That challenge is exacerbated by recent changes in the market that make it more expensive to build, by some of the pressures around zoning and permitting processes that make it challenging about where you can build and how fast you can get approved. And it's a problem that we can overcome. We want to help. we're putting our hand up and saying, we will help lead the charge, but we need other levels of government to come with us. We want to support the nonprofit sector. We are topping up significantly the Affordable Housing Fund with an additional $1 billion over and above the $1 billion top up in the recent fall economic statement. We're moving forward in a very exciting way with an acquisition fund, the rental protection fund, worth $1.5 billion that's going to help stop the bleeding, the loss of existing units that exist organically in the market at low prices, but are going to be bought up and renovated and offered at prices that low-income families cannot afford. We have new supports to help communities who are supporting those who do not have a roof over their head through a significant top up through the Reaching Home program, which should help stabilize the level of funding for communities, and an exciting new opportunity to help communities who are wrestling with the challenges around encampments by supporting those and insisting provinces cost match to actually drive an outcome that results in people being transitioned to durable housing solutions. Of course, there are unique areas of responsibility where we believe the federal government has to increase its ambition, in particular by addressing the needs of veterans who've served in the Canadian Armed Forces and find themselves living without a home. Indigenous housing, whether that is the distinctions-based program on reserve, whether it's the urban, rural, and northern program to help those who've severed their connection to the community, or whether it's the housing needs of asylum seekers. There are unique areas where we feel there is a heightened responsibility for the federal government, giving our constitutional responsibilities, and we want to make good on the obligations that we owe to particular cohorts of Canadians. None of this happens through the federal government's action alone. We believe we can solve the housing crisis, but we need other levels of government to come with us. I spend a lot of my time these days engaging with provincial governments, with municipal governments, and we also have to ensure that we're doing what we can to support those who are actually doing the work on the ground. To the housing providers that are joining us today, I'll conclude the way I began. I want to say thank you. I so sincerely appreciate the effort that you put in every day. I hope that you will see some of yourself reflected in the housing plan. It was not created behind closed doors in Ottawa. It was informed by people who know what they're doing in communities in every part of this country. It is not a written in stone forever and a day. This is a plan that is a very, very helpful launching point, but we retain the right to make improvements as we get real world data about the impact of the measures that we put in place, and we'll constantly be looking to do more in order to solve Canada's national housing crisis. I'll leave my comments there so we can transition to questions. If you see me taking a selfie in a moment, I promise there is a vote in the House of Commons. It'll only take me about 30 seconds and we can pick up momentarily. But thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Minister. I just want to say quickly that we really appreciate the support for the community housing sector and the work there. And as we let the minister vote, we will just take a few minutes here. You can maybe perhaps view this as an opportunity to see democracy in action. So, and then I want to remind everyone for the Q&A section to send your questions through the Q&A box. We already have quite a few loaded up, so I promise we'll try to get through as many of them as possible. Though we might unfortunately not be able to do so. And I think we're good to go. I'll actually go to the first question received today because I think it speaks well to the integration with other levels of government in particular. And this is from an anonymous attendee, so I'll ask this question myself. The budget clearly focuses on enabling a sustainable amount of rental housing production, but the municipalities hold the key to enabling this. Especially as for the for-profit developers are pulling back, municipal action matters more than ever. What are your expectations of the municipalities to make this succeed? Can you talk about what kind of timeline you're expecting to make these funds available so that municipalities can get the message to remove planning barriers in advance?
Look, excellent. It's a great question, and it's so there's a few different aspects to it. So the first is what are the expectations I have of municipalities to make this succeed? it's largely to get out of the way. It's and some communities are very good, and some are reticent to make the kinds of changes that will make it easier to build homes. When it comes to some of the municipal rules around rental and around multi-unit buildings in particular, and I think they've got to step up their effort to go faster. I should be careful. I don't want to paint all municipalities with the same brush, but there's certain themes that I see emerge. And I just think back to where some of these zoning practices came from. We wanted to separate many years ago industrial pollution from the areas where people lived. And I think that's a good zoning practice. But when you see this central planning phenomenon that's carried on over decades, you've ended up creating a patchwork of so many different sets of rules. It's difficult to know how to comply with them. And it's driving the development of cities, not by the people who live in them and love them, but by people who are employed by municipal governments. And again, many are very good who want the same things that I want. And sometimes the best intentions get in the way of progress. I think to myself of the opportunities when you travel to different parts of the world to see how different communities do it. You see a range of different homes, single family homes next to small apartments, not far from larger apartments, near transit stations. I have an expectation that there's going to be a much higher level of density. Near university and college campuses, I have an expectation there's going to be a much higher level of density. When I think about the circumstances in a housing crisis and the idea that some communities will tell someone who owns property in that community that it's not legal for them to build a building that has 4 units. This doesn't make sense to me. It offends a basic sense of a freedom for the landowner, but it denies a solution to the entire community when it comes to the opportunity to crowdsource investments that are going to help provide more rental options to people who live in these communities. In terms of the timelines to make some of these programs available, some of it's rolling out the door already. The Housing Accelerator Fund really got underway in September of this year and has now led to 179 successful agreements that has fundamentally changed zoning and permitting practices in communities in every part of the country. There's a $400 million top-up that we hope to be rolling out over the next few months. There's new opportunities as well with agreements that we hope to reach with metro regions for new public transit investments that will allow us to deal with additional density, particularly near transit stations, but certain other requirements as well. And we expect, although the money flows in 2026, the agreements we hope will be signed in the second half of this year, including some of the conditions that will make it easier to build homes. When it comes to the Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund, if we're going to be supporting water and wastewater, we're going to insist that communities stop increasing their development charges and raising taxes on new homes if they want access to federal support to build the infrastructure that those development charges are currently going to service. There's no silver bullet here. We have to look at all the obstacles, whether it's development charges, whether it's restrictive zoning practices, whether it's delayed permitting processes. And although we may not have the legislative authority, we have the opportunity to create incentives. And we're willing to put those incentives on the table to identify the coalition of the willing and to speed up the process of these reforms and increase the level of ambition. I was so pleased to see a dramatic number of communities, well beyond what the Housing Accelerator Fund could properly fund, put their hands up and say, if it means I have access to additional support, I'll do more. So there's no shortage of ambition amongst municipal councils, municipal staff in this country, but by putting those incentives on the table, we can see real change and we can implement it in a fairly quick period of time compared to what I thought.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that answer, Minister. I think with some relatively clear timelines and ambitions, and we really appreciate that. I'm going to try and group as many of these questions into bundles as I can because there's quite a few coming through. So I'm actually going to go next to Jackie Hunt. So I believe you should be able to speak now and ask your question.
Thanks so much, Kenneth. Thank you, Minister Fraser, for providing some time today for these questions. We really appreciate it. My name is Jackie Hunt, and I'm the Indigenous Communities Representative for the CHRA and the chair of the Indigenous Caucus. The impacts of the housing crisis, as you know, are disproportionately impacting Indigenous people across Canada. My home province of Manitoba has the largest Indigenous population in Canada. I work in the homelessness sector in Winnipeg, and 75% of those experiencing homelessness are Indigenous. And for us, that's a heartbreaking reality we witness every day. We are working desperately and collectively within our community to end chronic homelessness. And we know the key to achieving this is to have an adequate housing supply across the spectrum of housing needs. We believe in the housing first model, but without that roof to put over a person's head, we will never meet our mandate of ending homelessness. We need to see urgent action to deliver on the Indigenous, urban, rural, and Northern Indigenous housing strategy. In budgets 2022 and 23, the government committed $4.3 billion for the strategy. And I just have a quick 2 questions here. Can you share with us any timelines you have for when this money will begin to be dispersed? It may have already been announced in some of the things you talked about today. And since we know the need is much greater, are there any plans to commit any additional funding or supports to this program? Thank you for your time.
Excellent. Look, thank you, Jackie, for the question and for the work that you do to serve a group of Canadians who are extremely vulnerable and need our support. So look, you've asked 2 fairly clear questions. I'll do what I can to answer them with equal clarity. So first on the timelines, there's a couple of different tranches of the $4.3 billion. There was an additional approximately $300 million that was being delivered through an organization called NICHI, who you're likely familiar with, that is currently administering that first tranche of funds. We are running an RFP process right now to identify the group that will form the center to administer the bulk of the remaining funds that will be Indigenous-led to identify projects across the country that will be supported by the program. I hesitate. I expect we will have the center identified in a very short period of time. I'm hoping this is a matter of measured more likely in weeks than in months, but it's not complete yet, so I don't want to put a date for you to circle on the calendar, but we're very, very close to completing the process. That's to identify the organization that will administer the funds. The actual disbursement of those funds will not be driven by the federal government because we're choosing to do things differently by empowering the Indigenous-led organization who will form the center to actually make the decisions. We're trying to divorce ourselves from the approach of Ottawa knows best when it comes to meeting the needs of Indigenous peoples across Canada, and have chosen to have a program that's developed by and for Indigenous peoples. The second portion of your question is, since we know the need is much greater, are there any plans to commit additional funding and supports to the program? So for now, this is a $4.3 billion program, though we do tap into the other affordable housing programs to support Indigenous housing outcomes. We also have the $4 billion for community housing on reserve or in being managed by distinctions-based groups across Canada. And when I speak with Indigenous leadership, they'll often tell me about the needs of their own community, saying if we build more housing in community, it may actually allow more people who've previously left the community to come back. So it's an indirect way of potentially helping with some of the same challenges. But yesterday I was meeting with Treaty Region 6, 7, and 8 in Alberta to discuss the urgent need to fund homelessness more generally, not just through the urban, rural, and northern program, to meet, they were discussing with specific reference to Edmonton, given the disproportionate overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples amongst the homeless community in that particular city. So we're starting through the urban, rural, and northern piece with a $4.3 billion fund. We will be tapping into some of the other programs to further address some of the similar concerns. But to the extent that we see opportunities to do more, I'm certainly not going to close the door on that possibility. We want to see what capacity we have to get this money out the door. And should we have an opportunity to achieve additional progress and see that there is a good return on the investment, we'll consider that once we have good information about the impact of the investments that we've now budgeted for.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Minister, for that question. I think that was very helpful. Next up, we are going to ask a question from Carolyn, who has a lands-based question, which I think a fair number of the group has as well. So, Carolyn, I think you might be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, Kenneth, and thank you, Minister Fraser. Ooh, I'm unmuted, but I'm not unscreened. Thank you for your leadership, Minister Fraser. One of the areas where I know you're doing leadership is in creating standardized need assessments that are rolling out to municipalities with the Housing Accelerator Fund. Those housing need assessments provide an opportunity to count homeless people in a consistent way, to count low-income people in a consistent way, to look at priority populations like Indigenous people and single moms, to look at sizes of households. What kinds of sub-targets are you thinking of to address the needs that are identified in those needs assessments? And I'm thinking specifically of France, for instance, which has had 20% non-market community housing targets since 2000, raised it to 25% in 2016. In Paris, the target is 30% non-market housing. What sorts of targets are you considering to help ensure that the housing meets the needs of those who need housing the most?
Look, thanks very much for the question and for a few opportunities to benefit from your advice along the way. So with respect to the question about targets for non-market housing, I'm going to share my own perspective because there's not, as part of the housing plan that we've released to date, an official non-market housing target that's been built into it. My own view is that the housing needs assessment and some data we already have through Stats Canada provide a good starting point, but we have more work to do to make sure that the target will actually reflect the need. My own view is that we should tie the target to the rough proportionate of people who cannot afford to live in the market in which they live. That depending on who you ask, the number could range from a little more than 10% to, depending on how you calculate it, to in excess of 20 or 30%, depending on your metric. My goal with the housing plan and the stated goal built into the plan is to achieve a level of affordability that regardless of your level of income, you'll be able to find a place to live in your community at 30% of that income. This is going to create real challenges because that may exist in certain small markets that don't have the same housing crunch as our big urban centers. But in Toronto, it would certainly demand a much higher level. So at risk of giving a partial answer, I'm not trying to be tricky here. It's mostly driven by the fact that we have to get the data from the housing needs assessment in a way that we can make informed decisions. I'm going to be seeking to identify at as local a level as possible what level is going to actually make sure that everyone in a community has a place to live that they can afford. My sense right now is that whatever the appropriate number is, we have to do everything we can to build more non-market housing as quickly as we can and transition some market-based housing into the non-market. This is going to be a multi-year project that will require us to do what we can to grow the non-market housing supply. But in the short term, I think we can make an improvement to get closer to that OECD average. But I think I'll be better positioned to establish an appropriate target once we have the opportunity to review a consistent set of housing needs assessment that come in through various negotiations we're having with provinces.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Minister. I think next I'm going to go to Karen Bradley, who has a question.
A familiar face?
Hi, Sean Fraser. Thank you so much for taking the question. Of course, you're going to know what my question is, which is how are you addressing the needs of small rural communities who have to compete with the big urban centers for federal dollars?
Look, thanks for this. Largely by dedicating a portion of the different funds for rural communities. And there's some opportunities that we have to reduce the administrative burden for smaller communities, particularly when we're dealing with organizations who've got a history of dealing with CMHC, who administers most of these programs. We also have the opportunity to support though this may be beyond the nature of the question, support the infrastructure needs of small communities with specific and dedicated funding that different communities can use to support smaller communities. I know there's a unique issue, obviously, in Musquodoboit Harbor and HRM, given that most of the infrastructure funding runs through municipalities. But for CMHC, there's a number of things that I think we can do. So if you look at a program like the Housing Accelerator Fund, for example, we carved out a portion of the funds for small small towns and rural communities. We're looking at doing similar things with some of the other funding programs that we have. On the administrative burden, there are some challenges that we run into, particularly for organizations that are applying for the first time. CMHC on its whenever they're dealing with a financing component of a program, I've come to understand the need to ensure that they have appropriate risk assessment for a given project, for a given developer or nonprofit, to make sure that they have the opportunity for money they count on being repaid to actually get it back. They also have some opportunity to properly assess the risk of money that they'll be putting towards nonprofit programs. But we're working right now to develop a streamlined pathway that will allow two different sort of improvements over and above funding carve-outs within the bigger buckets of funds. The first is through a frequent builders program. So if you're somebody who's got a long history with the organization, we're going to reduce wherever we can the need to ask you to provide information that we already have on file from our previous dealings with you. That's going to reduce the administrative burden, particularly for a lot of groups in smaller communities that don't have the capacity to fill out the forms and to take the phone calls every day because they are volunteer driven. The second piece that I think is going to provide a unique opportunity is the portfolio approach that we are now moving forward with through the various CMHC funding programs. This is going to allow us to, rather than deal with a new application for every project, if there are multiple projects being pursued by a group or perhaps a consortium of groups or even a province-wide basis, we'll have the ability to support through a single application a block transfer of funding for a series of different projects. So this may require in smaller communities some collaboration amongst organizations to work with an individual group who can work on the behalf of multiple entities through a consortium approach, but it's going to, over the course of the next number of years, I believe, and will significantly reduce the administrative burden. Karen, I think you know the part of the world I represent very well, given that you live in it, and I can tell you the needs of small communities have been on my mind when we were developing some of these plans. The housing crisis is no longer, maybe it never was, but certainly no longer to the degree it used to be, limited to our larger urban centers. The price of homes in rural Nova Scotia, where we live, has more or less doubled over the course of the past few years, and the vacancy rates are near zero in a lot of small communities. So I do think these measures are both going to carve out specific funding for rural communities, but also have an opportunity to significantly reduce the administrative burden, particularly with groups that are familiar with the federal government's programs.
Brilliant, thank you, Minister. It's nice to always have a bit of a hometown touch to some of the Q&As questions. I think next we're going to go to Véronique Laflamme. If you want to ask your question to the Minister.
Yeah. Hello, Mr. Minister. Yeah, concerning public land, we are wondering if priority will be given to social and community housing, because currently for projects by, for example, the federal land initiative, around 20% only of so-called affordable housing is required. So there is no priority given to community housing projects. So we are wondering if for the new initiative with Canada Post and other public land, we will have bigger goals of real affordable housing and a priority given for community and social housing projects.
Look, thank you for the question. I think it's an important one. So the answer is yes, but there's details that we still need to work out. If we're going to use public land, the reason we're doing it is not just to cure the supply gap in the market. It's to reduce the input costs so we can bring a heightened degree of affordability to the homes that will be built on public land. We're currently exploring a host of different ideas, and we may be able to try out a few different kinds of ideas because there's no shortage of public lands to choose from. And since we've made the decision to explore opportunities to maintain ownership of the land and lease it at a particularly low cost, the reason we are doing that is to achieve a heightened level of affordability. I don't want to be sitting in this chair where public land is sold off for single family home development. I think that would be a very poor use of public land and would preclude the government protecting the long-term interests of the Canadian people who are the owners of these lands. Now, that's not to say that 100% of the homes will exclusively be community housing. There may be room to test out different ideas that create mixed levels of income in given neighborhoods that provide an opportunity for people to live near folks who may have a different family household income. But we are going to be trying to leverage the land in a way that will provide maximum affordability. Depending on the costs of materials, supplies, labor, the rate of interest, we'll have to potentially adjust the specific metric to figure out how much truly affordable housing can go into a particular development and still allow the project to go ahead, because we have the dual interests of adding supply and reducing cost for in the market, but also providing more and more social housing for low-income families. So the answer is yes. There's not a clear target that's going to be applied to every project because we're developing a few different ideas. But the whole purpose we want to leverage public lands is driven by a need to build more affordable housing outside of the market. So more and more people will have a place to call home who can't currently afford to keep a roof over their head.
Brilliant. Thank you, Minister, for that. And I think we are now coming right up to the time that we have with you. And so I think we might unfortunately have to finish with the Q&A session here. I can see there are many more questions and and I hope that emphasizes the point to you, Minister, that there's quite a lot of interest in this plan. So on behalf of the CHRA, our members, and those of us who are here today, I just want to thank you, Minister, again for your time. We really do appreciate you making the effort to speak with us, especially as business in the House might be quite busy today in particular. And we look forward to working with you and your team on the implementation of these initiatives going forward. And then I'd also like to thank the participants in today's call. There's been some really serious engagement. And again, apologies on my part for not being able to get to the many, many questions we have in the Q&A, but hopefully you've all found this conversation productive. And I just want to make sure we have one last reminder for all of those who have not signed up for our newsletter to make sure you do that so you don't miss opportunities like this potentially in the future. And if you are not a CHRA member, please feel free to sign up and join us today. With that, I think we will conclude today's webinar, and thank you all for your time and hope you have a fantastic rest of the day wherever you all are.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.